What's good, guys, and welcome back to the channel. We've got a couple new subs over the last month, so I'm gonna take a quick second to reintroduce myself and explain what these videos are for. So my name is Marcello. I talk about media with a focus on 90s kids books, at least so far, and in this set of videos I am recapping, analyzing, and reviewing each of the Animorphs books in chronological order. I've read the series through 3 times prior to this, but I am by no means an Animorphs scholar. I love the books, but I've mostly read them casually. This is the first time that I'm reading the series through a critical or analytical lens, and as such, my opinions and analysis are totally subject to change and are not infallible. I highly encourage you guys to check out the comment sections of this or any previous video, as they are always full of excellent insights that I may have missed or simply haven't gotten to yet as I make my way through this series again. With that said, we are evaluating the books based on 4 categories. Overall plot, so how engaging the book is; significance, which in this case means significance to the greater overarching plot of this series; character development; and writing. Each category has 10 points, and they're weighted a little bit differently, and in the end each book will have a score, and I will have a list of my extremely personal opinion on which I consider to be the best Animorphs book, or the worst, or whatever. In this episode, we are going to discuss The Encounter, the first book narrated by Tobias, my favorite character. I already have a whole series on Tobias, which you should totally go check out, but as I mentioned before, my opinions and analysis of these characters and books have already changed over the course of this critical reread, so these will likely be very distinct videos with some separate points. So The Encounter was published in 1996 and was written by K.A. herself, again, no ghostwriters yet. The front cover, by David Mattingly, depicts Tobias morphing into a hawk. This is actually the first cover that depicts a morph not acquired in the book for obvious reasons. Here's a fun piece of trivia though. Tobias was originally described as a blonde by K.A., and the model that they contracted for the photo shoot was blonde when they initially hired him, but on the day of the shoot he showed up with brown hair. Subsequently, K.A. would describe Tobias as having dirty blonde hair to sort of retcon this into place. The book is dedicated to the Raptor Center of Minnesota, where K.A. learned how hawks live and act. And before we get into the book proper, here's K.A. on why she picked a red-tailed hawk as Tobias's Nothlit prison. K.A. says, "Tobias's form was chosen because red-tails are among the most common hawks in the US. I liked thinking that kids driving with their folks across Kansas or wherever would daydream that they were seeing Tobias. Probably should have made him a turkey buzzard since they're so ubiquitous. I knew right from the start that I would trap Tobias and morph, by the way. Never a doubt. Had to be. I knew it would drive some readers crazy, but I also knew they'd want to know more." I would say that this was very successful on all fronts. The red-tailed hawk is one of my favorite animals to this day, and whenever I see them flying around my backyard, I totally think about Tobias. With that, let's jump into it. By the way, I usually take my audio very seriously in these videos, probably way too seriously for someone with under 1,000 subscribers. That's not gonna be the case anymore. I've got a baby and a very flat-footed wife and a dog and neighbors with leaf blowers. There's a lot of stuff going on, and I really need to take whatever opportunities I can to shoot these, so please bear with me if you hear some background noise. It kind of is what it is at this point. Anyway, let's jump into the book. The Encounter takes place a few weeks, but less than a month after the events of the invasion. It opens with Tobias introducing himself, a portion that I usually skip in these recaps, but it's significant here because of how Tobias sees himself and how crucial that is to the prevailing arc of the first 3 books he narrates. His description of himself is fittingly confused. He says he's a normal kid, or he used to be, and he's already forgotten what color his eyes are, or were. His eyes are now gold and brown and fierce. In the first scene of the novel, Tobias is flying high on the thermals doing a personal mission. There's a fellow red-tailed hawk being held captive to serve as the mascot for Dylan Dan Hawk's car dealership. Tobias watches as Dylan Dan himself goes to feed the hawk, and he memorizes the combination for the lock that's holding the hawk captive. He then swoops out of the sky and, as a hawk, mind you, and during what appears to be some kind of live TV ad shoot, uses his beak and talons to unlock the combination, manually. As the various mechanics and TV people try to catch him, we learn that Rachel has been waiting in the wings as an elephant ready to provide a distraction. If you're familiar with the Animorphs, you know that they usually come up with pretty convoluted solutions to their problems, and this is a great example. The fact that Tobias didn't just watch, memorize the combination, and then have Rachel sneak into the car dealership at night as a human or a raccoon or something is indicative of many convoluted plans to come. Ultimately though, Tobias does free the hawk, and he and Rachel escape. As they flee the scene, Rachel laments that the group is certainly going to ream them out big time, but she also lets Tobias know that she had a real blast stomping on some cars. Tobias then debriefs the reader on the ongoing invasion of the Yeerks, mentioning that he is already a casualty of this war through his Nothlit status. He then thinks about the lady hawk that he just freed, hoping that she's found a nice patch of forest with lots of mice and rats and shrews, because that's what they, or we, hunt. This is an introduction to the core conflict of this book. Tobias's identity struggles are ongoing, but this book predominantly focuses on how he chooses to define himself, with the adoption of the hawk diet representing acceptance of the simple fact that he is now trapped permanently in a hawk body. There will be greater growth and understanding to come, but as of yet, Tobias still hasn't even taken this first crucial step. Later, Tobias is on his way to Rachel's house, surfing some thermals again when he senses a huge presence in the air above him. He looks up and he sees this kind of weird ripple, which quickly disappears. He arrives at Rachel's, where she is just getting home. The other Animorphs are already in her room for some reason, waiting for her. They predictably castigate Tobias and Rachel for their little side mission, Marco most vocally so. Tobias describes Marco as the most reluctant of the Animorphs, but follows by stating that Marco has been with them from the start, which is true. Nevertheless, Tobias lets us know that he and Marco will probably never be close, and describes him with thinly veiled disparity, honestly. We get everyone else's backstory, which doesn't have anything new, and everyone soon calms down, and as they're wrapping up their meeting, Jake mentions to Tobias that he'll leave some chicken in a Tupperware in his attic for him. Tobias notices the rest of the group looking at him pityingly, and as he leaves the meeting, he laments how they all feel sorry for him and what he's become. A fundamental trait that we're introduced to early on is that Tobias is independent. Even as a human, he didn't really have anyone who took care of him, and he was a bit of a loner. This charity of Jake's, while characteristic of Jake, will not last. The meeting ends, and Tobias does not tell the Animorphs about the weird shimmery presence that he noticed in the sky. The next day, Tobias is flying to the spot where he noticed the big thing in the sky, and Kay mentions how awesome turkey buzzards are, which is funny considering her quote from earlier. Tobias describes the behavior of redtails, but he segues into a description of his current situation, which differs substantially from your average bird in that he eats cooked chicken out of a Tupperware container in his friend's attic. Tobias can practically hear Marco's jokes in his head as he thinks about this. Tobias talks about how he misses school, even though he was basically an orphan being shunted from relative to relative for his entire life. He wonders when, or even if, he will ever be reported missing when there is another ripple in the air above him, as he watches a flock of geese appear and crash into what is revealed to be some type of ship. Later, the gang is meeting in Cassie's barn, something that I've referred to in the past as the Gryffindor common room of the Animorphs series. They're discussing Tobias's discovery, while Tobias fights the hawk's natural instinct to either eat or run from the various animals in the barn with him. The group isn't convinced that what Tobias sensed was a Yeerk ship, since the only evidence he's given them is that he had a feeling when it passed over him. They have another big overarching moral debate about their participation in the war against the Yeerks, with Marco taking his usual stance of pragmatism and self-preservation, prompting an argument between Marco and Rachel that results in Marco accusing Rachel of being a danger junkie who's willing to risk all of their lives to save a stupid bird, referring to the hawk from the beginning of the book. This causes the group to fall into silence as the deep insensitivity of Marco's statement sinks in, until Tobias coldly states that regardless of what any of them do, he will be going to the mountains where he suspects the ship has been traveling to investigate. The gang, of course, agrees to accompany him. That weekend, the Animorphs are suited up and ready to go check out the mountains. This means a new morph, since they can't all be birds of prey as it would be too conspicuous. So while Tobias flies overhead, the rest of the Animorphs get to morph wolf and traverse the forest. Tobias uses this opportunity to reflect on his situation, wondering if he'll ask them what it's like to be a wolf after that. You can ask them what it's like to be human too, answers a self-deprecating voice in his head that often pops up to chug these inner monologues along. Tobias rejects this thought, thinking that if he started to feel sorry for himself, he might never stop. As he flies, keeping an eye out for the shimmery presence, Tobias notices a convoy of trucks moving along a dirt road below them. They look like park service vehicles, but as he watches, he sees several of them exit their vehicles, and they're armed with automatic weapons, which is a little bit much for park services. As he continues to watch, they surround a couple of campers and escort them out of the woods. As Tobias continues to look on, 2 helicopters show up and land about a mile from him. Out of these helicopters jump a battalion of Hork-Bajir warriors. Tobias hurries back to find his friends almost getting eaten by a real wolf pack before doing so, and he finally locates and debriefs them, and they decide to press on with their investigation. They're on their way to the lake where all these Yeerk forces have congregated when the shimmery presence once again appears in the sky, where it drops the cloaking technology that it was using, and the Animorphs are finally able to lay their eyes on this ship. It is huge, and Tobias describes it as being shaped like a manta ray, with a single bulging portion on top that contains the ship's only windows. Tobias can see taxons through the glass. As they continue to watch, a bunch of metal pipes like giant straws lower into the lake and begin sucking up water. The Animorphs reason that what they're looking at is a giant Yeerk cargo ship sent down to Earth to gather resources to supply what is probably some type of mothership in orbit. Tobias soars up to get a closer look, where he sees the hawk whose life he and Rachel saved in the beginning of the book. He gets closer to her, and he has the realization that he fears her. Even with these millions of tons of alien steel hovering over his head, this hawk is what gives Tobias a jolt of fear. As he deconstructs this, Tobias realizes that maybe it's not her that he fears, maybe it's the feeling of belonging that draws him to this female hawk that truly scares him. He banks sharply away and hurtles himself toward the solid ground, the antithesis of all the good parts of being a hawk, to find the Animorphs in an intense standoff with a pack of real wolves that almost ate him earlier. Glad of a distraction from the identity crisis that he nearly had in the sky, Tobias realizes that these two wolf packs are fighting over a dead rabbit, and thinking quickly, with the knowledge that his friend's time in Morph is nearly up, Tobias snatches the rabbit up, injecting enough chaos into the situation that it fully disrupts the ritualistic fight that the wolves are engaged in. As the gang escapes, Tobias gains some altitude in an attempt to get a visual on what time it is, and he manages to peep the dashboard clock of one of the park service vehicles, and he realizes that the gang has no time left in Morph. He hurries back to them, yelling at them to demorph, and they immediately start doing so, but they have a lot of trouble. After some substantial struggle, they're able to make their way back into their human form, but their relief at having narrowly avoided this close call just serves as a reminder to Tobias of the reality of his situation. Tobias feels a surge of panic as he once again grapples with the fact that he will spend the rest of his natural life in a hawk body with absolutely no recourse in sight. He flies away from the group with their cries ringing in his ears and his own thoughts ringing in his head. Later that night, Tobias returns to what he considers his home in this book, which is Jake's attic. Jake has removed a panel in the roof that allows Hawk Tobias to sneak in, and he's fashioned a bed for him out of an old dresser. This is where Jake leaves Tobias scraps of food, which typically include vegetables, which Tobias's hawk digestive system can't handle. As Tobias hunkers down for the night, eating some cold hamburger, he reflects on what he really wants to be eating: live prey. The hawk's hunger is getting harder to deny. He hops into the soft bed that Jake's made for him, but he knows that his hawk body doesn't crave soft blankets and enclosed spaces. It wants a branch and the breeze. Tobias flies out into the night, without a destination in mind, but inevitably he winds up at Rachel's house. He confides in her that he thinks that he is losing himself, telling her about his conflicting feelings over the Lady Hawk. She reassures him of his humanity, telling him that it's what's on the inside that counts, and showing him a photograph that she has of him for some reason. She tells him that she knows the Andalites will return one day and that they'll be able to get him his human body back somehow. Tobias, with all the powers of hawk senses mixed with human intuition, can tell that she's putting on a brave face for him, but he appreciates it nonetheless, reflecting that maybe he went there to borrow some of her strength. While Rachel's attitude and confidence is certainly helpful, what she's saying here is not helpful at all. Tobias needs acceptance, not hope. Hope that he will regain his human body will only add to the resistance that he's feeling about the compromises he invariably will wind up making. I think this is what Rachel needs in order for her to blunt her own sense of loss or despair for Tobias's situation, or the fear that she may one day meet the same fate. But we know that the transformations that the Animorphs undergo are not just skin deep. Each of the Animorphs has lost control of their morphs due to the instincts of the animal in question being too strong at some point. In the previous book, Rachel taps into the cat's nonchalant confidence in order to navigate her way out of Visser 3's clutches. Tobias is Hawk. What part of him remains human is as much of a question as his ultimate fate is at this point. I do think it's safe to say that Tobias is a human at his core, whatever that core is, or at least not a Hawk. The mental gymnastics required to seek Rachel for comfort while knowing that she's just putting on a front for him are very human. So let's take a moment to pause and reflect on the themes that have been established in this book so far. The core question of this book is who or what is Tobias, with a secondary question of where does he belong. These questions are explored through two separate avenues, both of which are tied to the core needs of living things: to eat and to. Although sex isn't strictly necessary for an individual's survival, it certainly does have a strong biological drive, and it is necessary for the preservation of a species. In this book, given the age range of its target audience, sex is kind of represented by Tobias's desire for companionship, but I think that we can all agree that when he thinks about being with the Lady Hawk, he's not thinking about spending time flying around chatting about thermals. Anyway, both of these core needs are causing intense inner conflict for Tobias. Should he try to remain human and let Jake feed him human food that he knows isn't ideal for his hawk stomach and live his life denying that he wants to eat mice and rats and whatever else? Or should he cede to his hawk desires and hunt? On the companionship front, should he continue to seek comfort from Rachel when he knows that she's unable to give him what he needs, or should he just go elope with another hawk? Tobias feels an acute need to answer these questions, likely as a way of processing the trauma of his current metaphysical state. Further complicating things is the ongoing call of the hawk's biological instincts. Let's get back to the book. Tobias winds up spending the night in the drawer in Jake's attic after this encounter with Rachel. He spends the next day flying around while the gang is at school, and we get a few reminders of the positive aspects of hawk life. Flying, a lack of homework, thermals, flying. I feel like KA is very intentional in her distribution of these scenes. We frequently toe the line of existential crisis, only to be pulled from the precipice with a reminder that flying is probably about the coolest thing that anyone could do. These passages stuck with me so much as a kid, to a point where I'm currently pursuing my dream of becoming a hang glider pilot just so that I can get close to the experience that KA describes in this book. The heavier parts of Tobias's crisis or identity weren't totally wasted on my child brain, but I definitely appreciate them a lot more as an adult. Later on, the gang meets to decide what to do about the Yeerk ship that keeps coming down to steal our natural resources. Tobias watches them all approach Jake's house, trying to avoid paying attention to the various prey animals that his hawk brain is wired to notice running around the lawns. Once together, the gang brainstorms and comes up with a loose plan to break into the Yeerk ship and somehow disable its cloaking technology while it is above a populated area. They theorize that secrecy is obviously very important to the Yeerks, and this would likely be severely disruptive to their overall strategy. The meeting ends with Jake ominously suggesting that the best way into the ship will be through the pipes it uses to extract water from the earth. As fish. It'll be Tobias's job, as the dropout of the group, to scout out the location in advance. As he flies off, Tobias ruminates on how he'd love to hang out and play Doom with the boys, but joysticks and controller pads aren't made for talons. There are a lot of great angsty one-liners packed into Tobias books, by the way. It's part of their charm for me. So Tobias flies around for a while, sort of torn between sadness on all that he's missing out on and appreciation of all the things that he can experience with his new hawk form. As a human, Tobias never really experienced a ton of freedom. Sure, he didn't have parents on his back, but he had all of the limitations that a scrawny, bully magnet human kid would have, and he was firmly tethered to the ground. These thoughts perk him up a bit, and he soars for a while, letting himself be, and enjoy being, a hawk. He flies to the woods behind Cassie's farm, happening upon a small meadow that he notes would be perfect for a true red-tailed hawk's territory. He's deep in hawk comfort, with his human guard fully down when, without thinking, he dives down and catches a rat. He describes a surge of elation that surpasses anything that he's ever experienced as a human as he closes in on the kill, and before he can stop himself, he has eaten. He screams internally, but he can't fly away from the image of the dead rat just as much as he can't get its taste out of his mouth. This may not seem like a huge deal on first read. I know that it didn't seem like a huge deal to me when I first read the book, at least. I was mostly just waiting for Tobias to start eating mice so that we could get on with fighting the Yeerks. But this time I'd like to take a moment to appreciate how fundamentally disturbing this must have been for Tobias. Yes, hawks eat mice, and Tobias is a hawk. But what if, rather than conceding to this hawk desire, he'd instead given into his hawk instinct and banged the lady hawk? Pretty disturbing. I put these on even footing in my analysis in terms of how important they are to Tobias's acceptance of who or what he is, at least at this stage in his character development, and I think that we could swap one for the other without it having a major impact on the plot of this book. It's not like he and Rachel can ever be intimate anyway, just as much as Tobias can't eat the human food that Jake keeps leaving him. I would even go so far as to say that eating a rat is almost a stand-in for banging the lady hawk, if not for the fact that the dietary change is a necessary and permanent part of Tobias's plot development. Let me know in the comments, please. Do you think that this is true? More importantly, does it matter? And is my analysis completely off the wall? In any case, Tobias feels like he's ceded a piece of his humanity by allowing this to happen. Tobias's first instinct in the wake of this action is to try to find Rachel, which gives some credence to my theory that eating the rat was kind of an emotional stand-in for banging the lady hawk. Having ceded one of his main biological needs to the hawk instinct, he's frantically seeking to validate and bolster one of his fundamentally human qualities, his attraction to Rachel. Rachel's at a gymnastics competition that for some reason is taking place at the mall. Tobias is in a blind panic, as close to a full existential crisis as he's ever been. He approaches the mall and he dives at the door at full speed, not caring if he hits the glass, but someone opens it just in time. Inside the mall, he's flying frantically, nearly hitting things, but he still doesn't care. He almost wants to injure himself, to crash into something, telling himself that it may wake him up from this nightmare. Eventually, he finds Rachel and her gymnastics troupe or whatever at the center of the mall. She recognizes him as he once again attempts to fly into an immovable object at full speed, and she yells his name, which causes him to flare his wings and miss the obstacle, though his shoulder hits the glass of the skylight above them, and he falls into Rachel's arms. Tobias tells her what he's done, and he says that he's lost, and I think it's a safe bet that he's referring to his humanity here. She tells him that he's not lost as long as he has her and the others, and while this may be an important message for the book overall, I don't think it does much for Tobias in this moment. As the crowd closes in, Rachel gives Tobias a subtle push and sends him up into the air again, and he flies towards the skylight overhead. He allows his hawk instinct to take over, knowing that his hawk brain doesn't know that the glass is far too thick for him to break through, and that hitting it would be a near certain death. He chooses not to fight the instinct, reasoning that he may as well give in, and I would argue that this is not a hawk instinct, this is a human one. It's rooted in a desire to escape his problems through self-harm, which is pretty unique to our species, I think. The hawk, insofar as there is an autonomous hawk inside of Tobias, may not be aware of what is happening, but Tobias is not strictly a hawk, he knows what he's doing. As he's about to crash into the glass of the skylight, he sees a familiar face out of the corner of his eye, and we know this to be Marco, there to creep on Rachel's gymnastics show. And this figure throws a baseball, which breaks the glass and allows Tobias to reach the sky. I love that Marco is the one who saves Tobias here. There are no two characters further apart in sensibility than Marco and Tobias, I would argue, and they have very few moments of mutual goodwill throughout the series. But Marco is fundamentally a good guy, and I'd argue that he actually has the most mature character of anyone in the book. And here, he saves Tobias's life. Tobias spends the next few days as a natural hawk. He settles down in the meadow where he made his first kill, he establishes this as his territory, and he hunts throughout the day. Days pass easily for him, with the thrilling nature of the hunt, the satisfaction of each kill easily helping him to pass the time and keeping his human mind quiet. But at night, his human mind resurfaces with all of its insecurities and emotional needs. One day, Tobias flies to see the lady hawk, and as he watches her, he notices movement out of the corner of his eye, and he sees a human running through the forest being chased by a hork-bajir. He attempts to forcefully apply hawk logic to this situation, reasoning that the human is prey and therefore it should be killed, but something inside him rejects this assessment. This animal is not prey, he tells himself, this animal is a human. Tobias attacks the hork-bajir, and in this moment he feels his human mind fully resurface. Tobias feels the lady hawk watching him as he decides to help the human escape, and Tobias is at a crossroads here. The pull of the lady hawk is like a magnet for him, tempting him back into the simple black and white life that he's started to build for himself as a hawk, but he cannot let this human be prey. It's clear that the decision to help this individual human is representative of the greater decision to help the entire human population, more specifically to prevent them from becoming prey for the Yeerks. After this, Tobias goes to visit Rachel. Rachel tries to hug him, but, you know, birds aren't made for hugging, and he tells her how he's spent the last few days, and although Rachel seems sympathetic, Tobias can tell that she's bothered by his hunting for food. When Tobias tells her about the human whose life he saved, and his rationale behind almost letting the hork-bajir kill said human, Rachel attempts to make a distinction. The Yeerks aren't killing to eat, they're killing to control and dominate, she says. Killing for power or control is evil. Tobias agrees, but we've read Cassie books, so we know that this take is pretty shallow. The Yeerks are not purely after power and domination, nor are they homogeneously evil. For now, though, this reasoning will suffice to get Tobias into a state of mind where he does not feel like he is constantly standing on the precipice of ego death. Then conclude the conversation with Tobias reaching a tenuous conclusion. He will continue to fight the Yeerks and to help other humans regain their humanity, even though he'll never be able to regain his own, and maybe this will keep him human enough. I have to point out just a few flaws in this thinking, though, as glad as I am that Tobias was able to reach a fragile peace within himself here. Tobias has not had his freedom taken away. He's had the form of his body changed, sure, but if anything, he's more free than he's ever been. He still has autonomy, he's certainly much more free than the Yeerks' various hosts are, he can fly now. The thing that's holding him back the most is his apparent need to define himself, and then to use that definition as a lodestone to guide his future actions. Fortunately, this is only the first book that Tobias narrates, and he has plenty of personal growth to come. I also find Rachel's attempts to comfort Tobias to be very close-minded here. Rachel acts like she's okay with Tobias hunting for prey because she doesn't want to cause him stress by disapproving of it, but it does bother her, which in turn bothers me. It is true that Rachel is offering Tobias the only comfort she knows how to. Hope that that he may someday get his body back, but everything that Tobias does to further his acceptance of his Nothlit status is counterproductive to this goal, and I have to ask myself, does Rachel want Tobias to become a human because it's what's best for him, or does she want him to become a human because it's what's best for her? The next day, the gang proceeds with the mission. As a reminder, their plan is to morph fish and get sucked up into the Yeerk ship and then turn off its cloaking mechanism when it's above LA or wherever. They camp out in a cave next to the lake that the Yeerks have been sucking water out of and begin phase 1 of their plan, which is catching a fish. This takes a lot longer than expected, but they ultimately are able to catch one and to acquire it. Tobias keeps watch as the gang acquires the fish, and he notices the Lady Hawk, whose territory they happen to be in again, and he still feels that pull to join her. As he ruminates over Hawk mating behavior and the fact that he's definitely not ready to settle down yet, the Yeerks arrive. There's a convoy of human vehicles that clear the area prior to the cargo ship's arrival, and Tobias notices that everyone seems to be extra careful today, but he reasons that it must be because he helped that human escape last time he was in the valley. Then he sees 2 extra bug fighters, followed by Visser 3's blade ship. As Tobias watches, he sees the Yeerks firing Dracon beams at every animal that they can see. This changes things. Tobias goes back to the cave to report to the rest of the Animorphs, telling them that his plan is now impossible. There is no way that they're going to be able to sneak into the lake without being seen. The gang, however, refuses to quit. This may be their only chance to pull off a maneuver of this magnitude and end the war with the Yeerks once and for all. They ultimately modify their already convoluted plan. Rather than sneak into the lake, morph fish, and then get sucked up by the ship, and then morph another animal and raid the ship from the inside, they will morph fish one by one and have Tobias carry them in his talons to the lake and drop them in, which is somehow less conspicuous, where they will then proceed with the original plan. We are in book 3 here, and I advise you guys to buckle in because the plans do not get less convoluted as the books progress. So Cassie goes first, followed by Jake, and then Marco, and finally Rachel, who's nearly caught by a Hork-Bajir and a human controller who accidentally blasts a small hole in the cargo ship in pursuit of the 2 Animorphs. Ultimately, all of the Animorphs, except for Tobias, of course, are in the lake as fish. They proceed with their plan and are sucked into a giant tank inside the ship where they need to wait for it to fill up so that they can reach the presumed exit at the top. Tobias, meanwhile, flies around outside, avoiding the notice of the Yeerks and watching Visser 3 torture the Hork-Bajir who accidentally shot the pool ship earlier. Soon the Visser has enough information to realize that there are likely Andalite bandits afoot and that one of them may be in bird morph, and the bug fighters start shooting every bird they can see. Tobias has a fleeting concern about the Lady Hawk before he's under fire himself, but he escapes by landing on the cargo ship, where the bug fighters can't fire on him lest they destroy their own very expensive property. As he perches on the ship, bug fighters surround him, and Tobias recognizes that in this instance he is definitely the prey animal. Visser 3's blade ship soon joins the bug fighters, and the Visser himself is monologuing at Tobias when Tobias hears the faint thought speak of the Animorphs inside the ship. They are trapped, unable to escape the water tank aboard the ship, and they tell Tobias that no matter what happens, they can't be taken alive. They ask Tobias to destroy the ship if he can, otherwise they will morph human, and as they reach the mothership, they will take on battle morphs and go out fighting. Let's once again take a step back and look at this plan and the Animorphs' decision-making process here through a critical lens. They morphed fish to get on board this ship with no prior clue as to what its interior mechanisms were, and are defeated by a simple grate at the top of the water tank. Rather than attempt to morph something bigger, like a gorilla, and break the gate, or morph something smaller, like a green anole in Jake's case, and get through the gate, and then morph something else and raise the gate up so that they can all escape, they asked Tobias to attempt to destroy the ship and immediately resign to their fate. I'm once again bothered by the fact that the Animorphs mostly only acquire animals that are specific to each mission, rather than spending a few days just gathering as much DNA as possible in the eventuality that it might be of use in an unforeseen circumstance, like this one. The predicament they're in is a product of their own lack of plan, and their disjointed decision-making continues as they try to navigate this problem. I will remind myself that the Animorphs are teenagers and move on. So Tobias and Rachel have a I never told you moment before Tobias sees taxons crawling towards him on the surface of the ship. They're all armed with Dracon beams, which they point at Tobias before he attacks one of the taxons and steals its weapon. Tobias flies away, staying as close as he can to the surface of the ship so as to avoid further Dracon fire, and he races towards the ship's bridge with the goal of destroying the ship and the understanding that this will also kill his friends. He is successful in the first half of this goal, but the assumed consequence never comes to pass. As Tobias watches, a hole hole opens in the side of the ship and outpours all of the water that's in this tank, as well as his human friends who are able to morph their various birds of prey before finally escaping. This will be my last nitpick, probably, but wouldn't it have been better if they just stayed fish the whole time? I don't really know the physics of riding down what is effectively a massive waterfall into a lake and how this would play on the fish physiology, but it does seem like it would have been a lot safer and simpler to just stay fish the whole time. In any case, the Animorphs are safe, so we won't complain too much about it. The gang escapes into the trees, and the cargo ship explodes, and the shockwave of its explosion disturbs every animal in the forest, with various birds taking wing, including the ladyhawk who, as Tobias looks on, is vaporized by a Dracon beam. I guess he's stuck with Rachel. I made this joke in the last video, it just came out. Later, Rachel and Tobias are back in Rachel's room to have another deconstruction of what it means to be human. Rachel tells Tobias that they would like to find and bury the ladyhawk, admitting that the idea is a little crazy, but Tobias assures her that it's not a crazy idea, just a very human one. However, since this hawk is not a human, nor a part of the various ritualistic systems that humans have created, Tobias also believes that burying her would be inappropriate. She should be eaten by a raccoon or a wolf or some other animal. Tobias has gained something from her death, though. In his sadness over the death of the ladyhawk, Tobias has realized that he is human, or at least that he is not really a hawk. A hawk wouldn't feel sadness over the death of another animal. Tobias describes himself to Rachel as a predator who kills for food and a human being who grieves over death. This saddens Rachel, who Tobias notes is very human. The book ends with Tobias stating that he is a boy and a hawk and a mix of the two, and asking the reader to be happy for him and for all who fly free. And that's it. That's the book. Was Tobias's question answered? Not fully, but maybe that's because he was asking the wrong question. Am I hawk or human doesn't really have a simple answer, and it kind of just opens the door to more questions. What makes one human? Does Tobias have to be one or another? Are there different sets of morals for humans and non-humans? The list goes on. I feel like a more appropriate question might simply have been, what am I? But there's no immediate need to answer that question. Tobias is wholly unique, but he already was prior to being a Nothlit. All of the Animorphs are. Obviously, the way that Tobias frames his identity struggles is a product of the existential and fundamental change that he's undergone in being trapped in a hawk's body, but I think it's important to address these things anyway, because Tobias is far from at peace at the conclusion of this novel. I do appreciate that he describes himself as one who flies free in the final sentence, though. This contradicts his earlier statement that he understands how the human controller hosts feel being trapped and having their liberty taken away, but I think it's also an important part of his growth in this novel. He appreciates his freedom, whether it is essentially human freedom or not, and he's come to accept his state without the need to define himself by some nebulous pre-existing behavior profile that simply cannot apply to him. Okay, numbers time. I love this book. I love Tobias. You might call me Tobiased in my grading, but it's my video. I'm giving this book a 7 in overall significance. We learned some new things about the Yeerks, but the destruction of this cargo ship isn't as impactful as, say, destroying the Kandrona would be. The book is more of a character study than an integral part of the overall series plot-wise, but it is a very effective character study, and critical to understanding Tobias in future novels, so I am giving it a 10 for character. For writing, I'm giving this book a 9. I know that I said I'd give most of KA's books an 8, but I love the internal monologues here, the angsty philosophizing about the nature of existence and identity. I think it's all very well done. As an aside, I've been reading Chris Grind's graphic novel adaptations of these books as they've come out, and this one is phenomenal. Easily the best one in the series so far. So much of this book is just Tobias describing his thoughts to the reader, and Grind does a fantastic job of conveying this in a visual medium without the need to include all of the specific text of the book. He also uses different colored speech bubbles to convey Tobias's two, inner conflicting voices, which I thought was very clever and impactful. I can't recommend the graphic novels enough. I may do a video on them specifically one day, but for now, just know that they are excellent. So after doing all the math, the encounter wraps up with a score of 8.15 out of 10, which actually puts it at number 2 of the 3 books that I've reviewed so far, which is a little surprising, although not so much because I really did adore The Invasion, both as a kid and in this latest reread. Thank you guys so much for your patience while I take my sweet time getting through these, and thank you so much if you are subscribed. It is a special type of YouTube angel who subscribes to channels that have under 1,000 subs. It means a ton to me that people enjoy these videos. I love the insight that you've all provided in the comments section. All of this has been very validating, and I appreciate it. See you in the next one.